Jealous mom crashed my wedding by making a hateful speech about how I ruined her life. So I stood up and exposed her lies to all the guests, and now she's cutting me out of her will. So, for context, my mother and I have never had a very good relationship. She got divorced from my father when I was around 11 years old, and they had partial custody of me. I was supposed to live with my mother for alternate months, but I would end up spending not more than maybe 3 or 4 months at her place, and the rest of the time, I would just live with my father because apparently, my mother was too busy to look after me. I never knew what exactly she was busy with because it's not like she had a very high pressure job. She was a real estate agent and not even one of the top ones. So after a while, I began to suspect that maybe she just didn't want to spend time with me and was just coming up with excuses to avoid having me over. Even before the divorce, my mother and I weren't really close. I know little girls are supposed to be their mother's best friends, but my mother never really needed me. She had enough friends of her own, but I did need her. Sadly, she never understood that, and we grew apart with time. She would visit me at my dad's house from time to time and even have me over occasionally. But nothing really mattered to me after I turned 13 and reached an age where I could understand that my mother wasn't very connected to me. Whenever I would live at her house, I would just find myself wishing that I could go back home. Nothing about that place felt like my own, not even my mother. It got worse when she started dating and bringing her boyfriends home. I was in my late teens and I would get this feeling that she was sort of jealous of me and would treat me like competition. She would put me down all the time and make fun of me for no reason. Not only did it make me uncomfortable and angry, but it also made her date awkward around her. Because what kind of mother puts down her own daughter to win over some random guy? One time I even confronted her about it, and she said that she was just joking around. And that there was no need for me to take it to heart and act like the victim. So instead of getting mad, I started to do the same thing to her. Whenever she would pick on me and try to take digs at me, I would just retaliate and take jibes at her as well. It would turn into a little catfight, where both of us were just competing to see who could be the meanest. It didn't bother me and actually was kind of fun, but it did drive her dates away. So she stopped doing it after a while, and even I reduced my visits to her house. My dad was the one who would push me to have a relationship with her, and honestly, had it not been for him, I probably never would have even bothered to speak to the woman. There was also the time period from when I was 18 until I graduated college where my father was going through a rough patch financially because his business wasn't doing very well. I had to pay for tuition somehow, and even though I hated the very idea of it, I ended up asking my mother if she could help us out. She said that she was really sorry and that she wished she could help, but unfortunately, she didn't have enough money. Because she was also getting engaged and was saving to get married and go on her honeymoon in a couple of months at the time. I wouldn't have cared about that because obviously, she doesn't owe me her money. But when I saw her wedding, it was ridiculously extravagant and fancy, which made me feel a bit annoyed because I felt like she really could have helped me out with the tuition, and she chose not to out of spite. She could afford to help, but she chose not to, and that rubbed me the wrong way. And it was very funny because that wedding was probably more expensive than whatever I was going to ask her to contribute to my tuition. My father was ready to bear most of the cost, we just needed a little help from her. And that marriage didn't even last more than 2 years, so what was all the fuss even about? Even then, my father told me to let it go, and I did because it wasn't worth it and I didn't want to come off as an entitled brat. Now I'm almost 28 and I finally had my own wedding a couple of days ago. I invited my mother at the insistence of my dad, who thought that it would be necessary to have my family with me on such an important day. I wanted to say no to that, but I always have a hard time saying no to my father. So I did invite my mother, and she said that she was ready to attend. I told her that she needed to get her outfit approved by me because I knew that if I left it up to her, she would show up wearing something outrageously inappropriate. She sounded a little disappointed when I told her that, and I feel like she had every intention to upstage me, but it all went to hell when I said that she would have to get her outfit approved. She even asked me if I was doing this for everybody who was attending, and I said that, yes, I was, even though it wasn't true. Because I didn't want to give her any opportunities to cause any drama. She did send me a couple of outfits and I approved the least crazy one. I also told her that I would prefer it if she didn't make a speech or anything, and she seemed quite affronted by that. But I managed to save the situation by telling her that the only reason I was avoiding speeches was because my dad wasn't giving a speech either, and I didn't want the ceremony to go over time or anything because people were bringing their kids as well, so we wanted to keep everything as short and sweet as possible. Again, that wasn't true. But by the time she found out, it would be too late for her to do anything about it. I thought I was out of danger, and even though my mother was attending the wedding, I wouldn't give her any opportunity to mess anything up. But true to character, she did her very best and unfortunately succeeded in annoying me on the day of my wedding in spite of my best efforts. I really do regret inviting her. So, on the day of my wedding, after the vows were exchanged, it was time for the speeches. And as soon as my mother saw my father getting up to his feet and grabbing the mic, she shot me the dirtiest look she could manage. My father's speech was beautiful and emotional, so it put my mother's look out of my mind altogether. But then, to my horror, I saw her rising from her seat and taking the mic from my father. I wanted to do something, but I didn't want to create a scene at my own wedding by snatching the mic away from her. My husband tried to redirect everyone to the dance floor, but my mother said that she needed everyone to remain seated so we could enjoy the little speech that she'd spent days writing for me. I was terrified when she started talking, and sure enough, this speech was all about herself and how I had absolutely ruined her life by just being born. She went on and on about how many sacrifices she had to make as a mother and how I didn't seem to be grateful for any of them. She even threw in some tears to make it seem like she was hurt and brought up how I'd lied to her so she wouldn't make a speech at my wedding. She told everyone that she'd given up a really big promotion when she was pregnant with me because she didn't want to stress herself out before the delivery and feared that something would happen to me if she did take that up. Apparently, she was still paying the price of rejecting that promotion because she was still working in a similar position for similar pay. I knew that it wasn't true because my mother was pretty well off. I had no idea what she was complaining about, but she went on talking about how I'd been a pain to raise all along. She expected me to be grateful for it and reminded me of how many boyfriends she had given up on when I was in my teens. Because they didn't appreciate me being around and she couldn't sacrifice her motherhood. But clearly, I was willing to push her to the sidelines and pretend like she wasn't an important part of my life for heaven knows what reason. She ended the speech by telling everybody how selfless and great she'd been as a mother, but obviously, she'd failed if her own daughter didn't deem her worthy of even telling her the truth. It was a dramatic and mostly embellished story that she was trying to tell with that speech of hers. I'd put up with a lot of things about my mother over the last couple of years of my life. But this was way too much for me to tolerate, so I stood up and decided to reveal what kind of person she really was to everyone present there. Everything that I talked about in the first couple of paragraphs in this post is what I mentioned in my speech. Essentially, because it was that truth and I felt like I needed to set the record straight, and also because I wasn't going to let my mother get away with lying about me and playing the victim after ruining my wedding. I revealed the truth about how she used to treat me as a child and how she used to compete with me when I was in my teens, which is a pretty sick thing coming from one's own mother. My father's jaw dropped open when I came out with these stories from my childhood because he'd always insisted that we keep these things private. The world doesn't need to know everything that goes on in our family. He used to say it was because we didn't need to wash dirty linen in public, but honestly, I think it was because he cared way too much about appearances than about putting the truth out there. I could see everybody getting uncomfortable while I was ranting about my mother, and my mother just looked at the floor and occasionally glared at me, trying to scare me into shutting up. But unfortunately, the guests weren't her dates and I wasn't a teen anymore, so her intimidation tactics were becoming a little ineffective. After I was done talking, I was pretty much in tears and my husband took me aside. He opened up the bar and made sure that food would be served soon after, so the guests would have something to do rather than sit and gossip about me and the meltdown that I just had. He told my parents to stay away for a while and took me outside of the venue, to our hotel room so I could calm down. I was hiccuping because I was crying so hard and it took me several minutes to compose myself. He talked me through it and comforted me throughout. After a while, I finally felt better and said that I was ready to go back because there was no way I was missing my own wedding over something that my mother did. I'd always known that she was jealous of me, and this was just that jealousy manifesting in its worst form, nothing else. My husband told me to wait in the room for a while so he could go and check if my mother was gone, and even asked me if I wanted my father to stick around or not. I said yes, because in spite of everything he was still my father and I just didn't want to let him go. He came back up after about 10 minutes and told me that I could come back to the party because my mother was gone. Apparently, she'd left right after I walked out because she didn't come here to be insulted by her own daughter, and my father actually yelled at her and kicked her out after she said that. I was actually pretty pleased to hear that. As soon as I was back, my father apologized to me for everything and we hugged, which felt great. We resumed the event and a lot of my guests came up to me and told me that I was really brave for calling out my mother on her rubbish in front of that many people and on the day of my wedding, no less. My mother-in-law was also pretty impressed and said that she was glad her son was marrying such a strong and intelligent woman. That made me feel a lot better, and by the end of the day pretty much forgot about that little hitch. Once I got home back to my hotel room, I finally had enough time to check my phone, and there I noticed that there was a message from my mother that I hadn't read. I clicked on her chat out of curiosity and realized that she'd written a real speech and sent me a picture of that. I went through the speech that she'd written and it was actually pretty sweet. I noticed that she'd sent me that picture a couple of hours after she left, along with a message that said that this was the speech that she had written ages ago, pretty much on the day that I sent her the invitation. After I told her that nobody was doing speeches at my wedding, she'd almost discarded this, but then she thought she would give it to me on the day of my wedding so I could have it as an early wedding gift. Her actual wedding gift was supposed to be a car that I was meant to receive a week after my wedding, and it was supposed to be a surprise for me. But after my mother saw my father give a speech and even my in-laws take turns, she realized that I'd lied to her and was so hurt by that she said the things that she did. She told me that she was quite aware of our troubled history together, but she wanted to make things right when she received the invitation, and the speech that she had actually written was supposed to be her apology. But she never got a chance to make that speech because of my lies. She told me that she wished me nothing but happiness on this new journey that I was embarking upon, but she never wanted to meet me or hear from me ever again because I had broken her heart and insulted her all over some petty feud from ages ago. And after I read that message, I realized that I'd kind of screwed up by just assuming that my mother would do something to ruin my special day. She said that now, because of what happened, nobody wanted to talk to her, and she was really upset that I just assumed she would try and somehow ruin my wedding. After reading her messages, I was disappointed and have been for the past couple of days. I haven't yet told anyone about this because I don't want anyone to think that I'm the one at fault here. I don't even know if I really am or not. So Ida for assuming that my mom would do something to ruin my wedding and lying to her to prevent it? Update 1. Thank you for all the supportive comments, guys. It helped me think about everything regarding my mother in a new light. Maybe lying to her hadn't been the best idea, but I had to do it, given our previous tiffs. And I think it's pretty convenient that she just shifted the entire blame onto me, because I feel like if she wanted to make a speech that badly, and apologize to me for everything, then she could have done so even after she found out that I'd lied to her about my no speeches policy. I don't even understand where was the need to make such a public apology. It wasn't as if everybody in our family was aware that we didn't share a good relationship. Only a couple of people close to me knew about it, so there really wasn't any need for her to apologize at my wedding. Besides, it wasn't even the place or occasion for that. It was a day meant to celebrate me and my husband and not bring up things from the past so she could make it all about herself yet again, but just in a different and more socially acceptable way. I told my dad and husband about it and asked their opinion on whatever she'd told me, and they brought up an interesting perspective as well. I showed them the picture of the letter that she sent me, and they pointed out that the letter didn't look old at all and actually looked pretty recently written. My mother claimed that she'd written out this speech months ago, around the time I sent her the invitation. But if we were to go by that, then the letter should have at least looked a little folded or something. Just something to indicate that it had been a while since she'd written it, but there was nothing as such. So it was quite possible that she wrote the letter the very same day, after she was kicked out of the wedding, and sent it to me to guilt trip me. I would hate to believe that their theory was somehow true, but I don't know. Going by my mother's behavior in the past, I can't exactly rule it out. The bottom line is, I'm not going to talk to her, and I'm definitely not going to feel guilty about this. Update 2. So it's been close to 8 days since my wedding. My mother hadn't contacted me so far, and I thought that she was over the whole thing. But yesterday she showed up at my house. Since it was the weekend, both my husband and I were at home, and she mentioned that it was good because she wanted both of us to know this. And she also wanted my father to hear about what she was just going to tell us. I was really confused and almost didn't even let her enter, but she pushed her way through and sat herself on the couch. Then, she announced that she decided to leave all her money to charity instead of to me like she'd planned initially. She looked at my husband and then told him that because of my awful behavior, he could now say goodbye to all the money that we were about to inherit. She told me to tell my father about this as well because he'd been the one to kick her out on the day of my wedding. She really took that insult to heart and told us that we were not going to inherit anything from her. After she was done with her announcement, I brought up what she'd said at my wedding, in her speech about how I had ruined her career and everything. About how she had to reject that promotion because she was expecting me, and how she was still working in a mediocre position because she never rose in the ranks after that. She looked a little flustered because she probably didn't expect to be called out on her lies like this. She told me that had it not been for my birth, she probably would have been working in an even higher position at a better company, but was stuck because of me. I laughed at that and told her that if she really had wanted to be at the top, then she would have worked hard and accomplished something, instead of sitting around and blaming me for her shortcomings. I brought up how she'd had enough time to do something and go ahead in her career because it wasn't her who was taking care of me as a child. It was mostly my father doing all the hard work. So if he could juggle both raising a kid and going ahead with his business, then she had no excuse. She tried to argue, but I shut her down and told her that I didn't want her money anyway because I had my own and so did my husband. Besides, it wasn't even as though she was going to leave us a fortune. It didn't matter to us, so she could cut us out of her well and we still wouldn't care. Then, I politely asked her to leave, but she refused and told me that she wasn't going to go anywhere without an apology first. I started getting pretty annoyed by her and told her that I would call the cops and have her removed from my property if she didn't leave on her own. She tried to insist that I was bluffing and I would do no such thing to my own mother, but when she saw that I already had 911 dialed out on my phone, she got up, cursed at me nastily, and then stormed out. So that was our weekend. But it was nice to finally confront my mother and give her a piece of my mind without worrying about what other people would think. My husband was by my side through the whole thing, and even my father praised me for how I handled the situation. I really am very lucky to have them. Update 3. Hi, so it's been a week since my mother and I last spoke. She'd been texting me on and off for a couple of days, trying to get me to apologize to her, bringing up every single nice thing she had done for me as a child to emotionally manipulate me into feeling bad about what happened. But for every little good thing that she did right, there were like hundreds of things that she did wrong. So it wasn't exactly the right balance. I tried to ignore her for the most part and muted her notifications. But then she started texting me from her other number and finally forced me to block her. I hadn't blocked her so far because my mother lives alone, and if anything were to happen to her, I would want to know. No matter how bad our relationship is. But now, I don't think that I need to stay in touch with her anymore or keep that door open. If something, heaven forbid, happens to her, I have her neighbor's phone number and I'll be able to check up on her that way, without directly giving her access to me. I just can't be kind anymore and keep prioritizing family over my own self. It's not fair to me and I'm just not going to do it anymore. Update 4. Okay, So it's been almost a month since my last update and I really thought that it would be my last one, but I guess not. I just heard from one of my relatives that my mother was moving out of state and she'd made a pretty big deal out of it on social media by making a post where she mentioned me and my father by name and said that since we, her family, were no longer speaking to her anymore, she didn't see any point in staying on because there was nothing left for her here anymore. It was a pretty emotional post overall, but I didn't respond to it and neither did I reach out to her because just like she said, there was nothing left for me there anymore. I appreciate that she at least tried to make a last-ditch attempt at getting us back, but unfortunately, I'm way past the point of forgiveness now. I wish her the best for her future, but I wish I never have to meet her in the future. As cruel as it sounds, it's the truth.